This is BBC One. Now the BBC News with Hugh Edwards. It's 6 o'clock.
America is pounded in the world's biggest terrorist attack. Thousands are feared dead after New York and Washington have been hit. Hijacked planes crash into and destroy the towers of the World Trade Center. The Pentagon is another target. The White House has now been evacuated. Nationwide panic as Americans try to understand the scale of today's events. Good evening. The United States was hit today by the biggest wave of terrorist attacks ever seen. Thousands of people could be dead after several hijacked passenger planes crashed into targets in New York, in Washington, and possibly in Pennsylvania. Today's bewildering event started just 4 hours ago when the twin towers of the World Trade Center were hit by 2 aircraft. Both of the massive towers have now collapsed. The Pentagon in Washington was hit, and all major buildings have been evacuated, including the White House. The FBI believes the attacks were all suicide missions, and several passenger planes are still unaccounted for. There's no word yet on who might be behind the world's biggest terrorist onslaught. As you can imagine, the chaos there is terrifying. We'll have live reports shortly, but first our correspondent David Loyne on what's happened so far today.
It came out of the clear blue sky on a mild fall morning in Manhattan. At first, no one knew what had happened. Could it have been an accident? Surely nobody would fly into the twin towers of the World Trade Center on purpose. But 8 minutes after those first pictures, the full startling reality of what was going on became clear. In slow motion, you can see a Boeing 767, a passenger plane, crashing into the South Tower. A BBC correspondent, Stephen Evans, was on the ground floor of the World Trade Center when it happened.
I was on the ground floor of the building, sitting in a chair, waiting for somebody to turn up, as you do. There was a huge bang. It felt to me like somebody dropped a skip full of rubbish, a great container full of rubbish from a very great height. At which point, smoke appeared everywhere, as though a mist had suddenly settled on the building. We all streamed out, some people running, some people crying, nobody really screaming, across the road, and you look up, and you can see the top of one of the towers, smoke billowing out from it.
It is hard to imagine what must have been going through the minds of people on the streets below.
There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
President Bush was visiting a school in Florida.
I've ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand. And now, if you join me in a moment of silence. May God bless the victims, their families, and America. Thank you very much.
But it wasn't over, not by a long way. Almost as soon as the president had finished speaking, another airliner crashed on or near the Pentagon, the headquarters of the American Defense Department, causing panic in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. The White House was evacuated, and there was what looked like an attack on the State Department, which runs American foreign policy. Back in New York, firefighters were in the basement of the World Trade Center, wondering if the building above them was safe. But the nightmare went on and on. And it was all live on American television. First, one of the towers collapsed.
Thanks very much. Collapsed.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
That's the southern tower you're talking about?
Exactly. The second building that we witnessed the airplane enter.
The emergency services had cleared an area around the towers, but they'd not yet succeeded in evacuating the building. The people still inside had seen the other tower go and waved in desperation, but it was too late. And then the World Trade Center, proud symbol that it was of the wealthiest city in the world, was no more. At that time of the morning, there would have been about 10,000 people in each tower of the World Trade Center and thousands more in the Wall Street financial district around it. The emergency services have been doing what they can all day, but they are overwhelmed by demand in an atmosphere of terror. Every airliner in the air across America was ordered to land at the nearest airport. A plane crashed in Pittsburgh. As smoke blew across Capitol Hill, the heart of American democracy, it is clear that this is the biggest attack on America since Pearl Harbor.
Once again, we see terrorism. We see terrorists, people who don't believe in democracy, people who believe that with the destruction of buildings, with the murder of people, they can somehow achieve a political purpose. They can destroy buildings, they can kill people, and we will be saddened by this tragedy, but they will never be allowed to kill the spirit of democracy. They cannot destroy our society. They cannot destroy our belief in the democratic way.
In a brief break in the day, firefighters could embrace each other, but it will be many hours before their work is done, and many years before the full story of what this day means is told. David Loyne, BBC News.
Well, let's go live to Washington, and our correspondent there is Robert Watson. Rob, I know it's just 4 hours after this dreadful series of events took place, but what's the latest there this evening?
Well, the latest is that if this attack was designed to bring the United States to a halt, to bring the nation's capital to a halt, then it certainly succeeded. I've seen with my own eyes the city come to a complete standstill. All of the federal government buildings have been evacuated, including the White House. Now, you can probably see behind me to my left, the Pentagon is still on fire. There are said to be many casualties, almost certainly fatalities. Part of the building has collapsed. All around me, the streets have come to are at gridlock as people emptied out of buildings. They can't leave the city. All commercial airlines have been grounded. The U.S. borders have been shut. This is a scene of absolute chaos and devastation.
Rob, we heard from President Bush earlier on saying that all resources will be diverted to try to find those responsible. Is there any word so far from official sources there as to what their thinking might be?
Absolutely not, and I think it's fair to say that they are completely stunned by this attack, as indeed are all the Americans that I've come across. And you need to understand that there are thousands of people in the streets here in Washington, D.C. Nobody, of course, is talking about anything other than these attacks. But I think that the security forces were completely blindsided by these attacks. And I think that at the moment, the U.S. government is in some sort of disarray because, as I was mentioning, a lot of buildings have been evacuated. The CIA has been evacuated. The FBI, they are just scrambling at the moment to deal with the devastation. And I think they're some way from finding out who did this and, as George W. Bush has promised, hunting them down and then punishing them.
Robert Watson, thank you very much indeed. Now, in just 4 hours, the United States has been under sustained attack. As we were mentioning, the first news of today's attacks came through at 2 minutes to 2. That's British time, of course. Fergus Walsh is with me here to talk us through the sequence of events so far today. Fergus.
Well, Hugh, let's look at how the events of today unfolded. It began in Boston when 2 passenger aircraft were hijacked by terrorists. These were United Flight 175 and American Airlines Flight 11, both bound for Los Angeles. They were forced to fly to the World Trade Center in New York. A third plane was hijacked at Washington Dulles Airport. That was American Airlines Flight 77, again bound for Los Angeles. It was flown to the Pentagon in Washington. A fourth aircraft, United Airlines Flight 93 from Newark to San Francisco, crashed southeast of Pittsburgh. Now, the World Trade Center in New York was the fourth tallest building complex in the world, 1,350 feet high. The Twin Towers dominated the skyline of Lower Manhattan. The first impact was just before 9 a.m. New York time, 2 p.m. here. The hijacked aircraft crashed into the 80th floor of the North Tower, each tower being 110 stories high. Now, 8 minutes later, a second plane crashed into the South Tower around the 65th floor. Now, the World Trade Center is the largest commercial complex in the world. It's effectively a mini-city. 50,000 people work inside. It has 90,000 visitors every day. The casualties inside and on the ground are unknown. What we do know is that American and United Airlines say the 4 aircraft involved had a total of 266 passengers and crew on board. Now, within an hour, the Twin Towers had collapsed. Now, unlike most conventional skyscrapers, which have lots of interior columns to give strength to the building, the exterior walls of the World Trade Center bore most of the load, so the direct attacks were enough to weaken the buildings and lead to their collapse. Now let's turn to Washington. Within 45 minutes of the attacks on the World Trade Center, another hijacked plane had crashed in a direct hit on the Pentagon. One side of the 5-sided building was completely destroyed. Just over 30 minutes later, a car bomb exploded outside the State Department. Again, there's no figure on casualties. American fighters are now patrolling the skies above New York, Washington and other key locations to guard against further attacks. American military and government buildings across the world are on high alert. Other tall buildings in the US, such as the Sears Tower in Chicago, have been evacuated. America's day of horror is still unfolding. Hugh.
Indeed it is, Fergus. Thanks very much. And amid the chaos, the FBI and its international partners are already trying to work out who could be capable of planning attacks on this scale. Very few groups are thought to have the capability needed, and the Saudi rebel Osama bin Laden is one. He's currently in Afghanistan, where the ruling Taliban claimed today that he was not capable of an attack of this size. But according to Islamic Jihad, the attacks were a consequence of United States policy in the Middle East. James Robbins now on the search for the guilty men.
In the Arab quarter of Jerusalem, they're celebrating the massacre and mayhem in the United States. What's a disaster to much of the world is seen as a triumph by some. It's evidence of how much hatred has already been refueled by this disaster. Now American intelligence, which missed stopping the attacks, will desperately be searching for the culprits. And to find who's behind it, they'll first ask, how was it done?
I think it's almost impossible to believe that a hijacker could convince an American domestic airline pilot to commit suicide by flying into the World Trade Center. I have absolutely no doubt at all they had trained pilots. We know in the past that they've had pilots who have been perfectly capable of flying aircraft, and this can only be the only, I think, answer to this. American pilots would not do this, but Arab fundamentalists may well be prepared to.
Number one suspect has got to be this man, Osama bin Laden, the richest and possibly the most ruthless terrorist in the world. Bin Laden has declared the destruction of the United States his top priority. He heads and pays for an extraordinary international network of Islamic militants. And this evening, Israel's Prime Minister Ehud Barak told the BBC he thinks bin Laden is probably to blame.
Most probably a bin Laden-like organization, but I cannot say that I'm sure of it. But anyhow, it's an attack against our whole civilization, not just against the Americans. And I believe that this is the time to deploy to tackle this challenge head-on.
So what do you suggest that America and her allies do?
I believe that the whole leading kind of group of nations in the world, led by the United States, the UK, the European Union, and Russia, which is deeply understand the need to struggle against terror, will coordinate a globally concerted effort, diplomatic, operational, intelligence, and even economic.
Whatever the response, Osama bin Laden is already accused by the United States of bombing 2 of its embassies in Africa in 1998. 224 people were killed, including 12 Americans. It's only 3 months now since 4 Islamic extremists were convicted of those bombings by a court sitting in New York. Osama bin Laden was named by American federal prosecutors as the mastermind of these killings and a string of other attacks. Bin Laden is also suspected of involvement in this previous attack on today's major target, the World Trade Center. This bombing in 1993 killed 6 people and blew a 60-foot hole through 4 basement levels of the building. And this evening, many Palestinian and other Islamic militant organizations are distancing themselves from today's attacks. Perhaps they're fearful of American retaliation. A leading Middle East analyst in Britain hopes the blame won't fall on the entire Arab world.
It will stigmatize many, many innocent people, law-abiding people who have settled in the West. But what can states do? You've got to be practical.
Before today, the worst terrorist attack inside the United States was the Oklahoma bombing of 1995. And it was an American, Timothy McVeigh, who was convicted and executed for that mass killing. But tonight, nobody seriously believes Americans have been killing their own. And the mastermind for these latest attacks is being sought outside America's borders. James Robbins, BBC News.
And James is with me now in the studio. James, we've never seen anything like this.
Hugh, this is absolutely unprecedented. The Americans are already talking about a second Pearl Harbor with memories of that Japanese attack on the American mainland. No, this is quite extraordinary. And Americans are reeling. It's clear that the intelligence agencies, who are in disarray because they've evacuated their own buildings, they didn't detect the threat. They didn't detect any of the planning for an extraordinary series of concerted attacks. 4 hijackings, something the Americans have never experienced in their own territory, and coordinated attacks on this scale, from which I think American society will take a very long time to recover.
Now, you mentioned Osama bin Laden in your report there. Are there any other names that are being mentioned at the moment, and why is he at the top of the list?
He's at the top of the list because he had clear motive and he may have had opportunity. Osama bin Laden, this Saudi dissident, has pledged himself to a holy war against the United States, to the destruction of as much of the United States as he can possibly achieve in his lifetime. He has millions and millions of dollars behind him. He has many sympathetic friends among extremists throughout the Islamic world. He, of course, enjoys some shelter in Afghanistan. He has allies among the Taliban, the regime in that country. And although the Taliban are trying, I think, to keep retaliation away from Afghanistan, they may well still be giving him shelter. I think he remains #1 suspect, and that's where the Americans will direct their initial thoughts of retaliation. But they've tried attacking him and killing him in the past, and they've failed.
And very briefly, James, fears worldwide that other countries may be under threat, and Britain included.
I think it's absolutely clear that all of America's allies will now be in a state of shock and fear, or be making preparations. There's been a massive intelligence failure. They didn't detect these attacks. They'll be fearful of more.
James, thank you very much for that for now. And here, Mr Blair has summoned senior ministers to Downing Street for an urgent meeting of the Cabinet's Emergency Cobra Committee. He's offered President Bush any help he needs in the coming days. Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, Home Secretary David Blunkett and Defence Secretary Geoff Hoon have all been at number 10. Mr Blair was due to address the Trades Union Congress at Brighton this afternoon. He cancelled that speech, but he had this to say about events in America.
There have been the most terrible, shocking events taking place in the United States of America within the last hour or so, including 2 hijacked planes being flown deliberately into the World Trade Center. I'm afraid we can only imagine the terror and the carnage there, and the many, many innocent people that will have lost their lives. I know that you would want to join with me in sending the deepest condolences to President Bush and to the American people on behalf of the British people at these terrible events. This mass terrorism is the new evil in our world today. It is perpetrated by fanatics who are utterly indifferent to the sanctity of human life. And we, the democracies of this world, are going to have to come together to fight it together and eradicate this evil completely from our world.
The Prime Minister speaking in Brighton this afternoon. Let's join our political editor Andrew Marr, who's in Downing Street. Andrew, any word from that all-important meeting?
Yes, I think it's probably broken up. The Home Secretary, David Blunkett, has just come out a little while ago. We're expecting Tony Blair to speak to the country in half an hour, and we've just been told that meeting is effectively over. It is a crucial meeting, of course, because one of the things that the Prime Minister has to do at this stage is to review the state of security in this country. COBRA is the crisis meeting, if you like, of the government. Got all the key ministers there. And they'll have been looking at security in British airports. They'll have been looking at the state of policing. They'll have been hearing reports probably about the world economy and the effect on that. The Chancellor's in the meeting as well. And David Blunkett, the Home Secretary, as I say, has left a little while ago. He's got a very busy evening ahead of him now.
And as James Robbins was telling us a short while ago, Andrew, a special concern because, of course, Britain is such a close ally of America and President Bush's.
Absolutely. Tony Blair made it abundantly clear. Immediately he spoke that he was standing shoulder to shoulder with President Bush at this stage. We've been very closely associated with American policy in the Middle East, too closely for some British politicians. And nevertheless, Tony Blair made it absolutely clear that Britain was going to be right there. There are implications, clearly, for British security. And that's the crucial issue at that meeting. But nonetheless, it's going to ripple right across British politics now. The Conservative Party, for instance, announced earlier this evening that it was going to put off for 24 hours the announcement of its new leader. This is going to be an enormous event in British politics, as well as, of course, across the world.
Andrew Marr, Downing Street, thank you for that. The events in America provoked near-panic reactions worldwide, understandably, as Russia, France and other nations announced emergency measures, and airline companies struggled to cope with the chaos. Tom Simons now on what's been happening in Britain.
Britain's equivalent of the World Trade Centre wasn't officially evacuated, but shaken staff at Canary Wharf felt much safer outside than in.
It was a somewhat surreal afternoon in that we could see that all was going on, and then basically someone came round and said, right, everybody out.
Across the City of London, work stopped as horrified banking staff watched the television pictures from America or simply went home. Security levels at official buildings around the country are on high alert, armed police guarding America's embassy in London's Grosvenor Square. There'll be long delays tonight at Britain's airports. The complete closure of US airspace is unprecedented. Within an hour, all flights to America were either diverted to Canada or turned around mid-air and rerouted back to Britain, dumping fuel as they came. These American passengers had no idea when they'd get home.
The pilot came on and said, you may be aware that we've been circling, we're in a holding pattern. We are unable to enter international airspace.
BAA is considering a review of security at its 7 UK airports. In future, few airline passengers will be able to forget the way such an audacious attack so easily sidesteps checks designed to protect against terrorism in the air. Tom Simons, BBC News.
Live to Heathrow Airport now, and joining our transport correspondent there, who's Simon Montague. Simon, what's the word at Heathrow?
Well, of course, the shockwaves in the US have rippled to this side of the Atlantic. All US flights have been cancelled. Over at Terminal 4, that's the main departure terminal for the United States from British Airways, the biggest queue is actually at the hotel desks, where people are being told they may well not be travelling for 48 hours. Because, of course, even if US airspace does reopen, or when it does reopen, there's still going to be an awful lot of aircraft which are in the wrong place. So it's going to be 2 days and quite possibly longer before any kind of normality returns to transatlantic air travel.
Thank you very much, Simon, for that. Now, the Foreign Office has opened a telephone helpline for people who may be worried about friends or relatives. Here's the number for you. It's 0207 008 0000. That's 0207 008 0000. Now, there was understandable volatility on the world's money markets today. Trading was suspended on Wall Street, where the first attacks took place. Across the globe, there were urgent moves that affected currency and oil prices. Let's go live now to the City of London and our correspondent there, Rory Cellan-Jones. Rory, what's the latest from the city?
Hugh, the city has shared the general sense of shock. A lot of traders left their desks to watch the pictures coming in, and when they returned to them, share prices fell very sharply. The FTSE 100, which had been up, was almost 300 points down at the close. I think at the beginning of the day already there's been a sense that the world economy was teetering on the edge of recession, and now we just can't assess what this will mean. This kind of shock, the economy really on both sides of the Atlantic has been buoyed up by the confidence of shoppers. People are still going out and spending. Who knows what this will do to their confidence and what this will do to New York as a major financial centre. And of course London was the world's biggest financial centre, still trading this afternoon when this happened, because New York was closed. So a lot of the action was here. We saw the oil price also rise very sharply, and also the price of gold, which in past times has been something people buy in times of panic.
Rory, in the City of London, thank you very much. And we will, of course, have more from the United States later in the programme, but let's have a look now at the day's other news. A French court has blocked a bid by Eurotunnel for the immediate closure of a refugee centre near Calais. The company had argued that the centre has become a magnet for asylum seekers trying to enter Britain illegally. They accused the French authorities of encouraging traffickers. Eurotunnel say they will appeal. Our correspondent John Sopel is in Sangatte.
Last night, like every night, the illegal immigrants were on the move, making the short walk from Sangatte to the tunnel entrance, biding their time, waiting for the right moment to make a jump for it. But this morning, unlike any other, Eurotunnel were taking the French government to court, demanding the immediate closure of the refugee centre.
The apparent passivity of the French government to act against the human traffickers who operate openly in the camp, creating the conditions that facilitate the passage of clandestines towards England, is worsening the condition.
Eurotunnel, who are spending millions on security and daily are trying to make the incursions more difficult, have vowed to appeal against today's court ruling. Arguing to keep Sangatte open, lawyers for the French government somewhat extraordinarily wondered in court why all the media fuss about a simple disused warehouse, and said that closing it would be no solution.
They will stay here.
If it's closed, if you lose, what
They
will happen?
will be in the street.
So Sangatte will remain open now that the legal avenues have failed. But tomorrow everything is due to move into the political arena when David Blunkett is scheduled to meet his French counterpart. All sides agree that there's a problem, but finding a solution is proving more elusive. John Sopel, BBC News, Sangatte.
An Australian court has ruled that the government there must accept more than 400 asylum seekers who were refused entry after being rescued at sea by a Norwegian freighter. A judge said they were illegally detained when Australian troops boarded the ship. The Australian government is now set to appeal against the decision. New measures have been announced to try to prevent fresh outbreaks of foot and mouth disease when animals are transferred to lower ground in the colder weather. The government is introducing a strict licensing system for all animal movements, and tighter controls will be introduced in high-risk counties. Football, and Rangers are refusing to travel to Dagestan for their first-round UEFA Cup tie because of fears about their players' safety. The club had wanted UEFA, European football's governing body, to move the fixture following advice from the Foreign Office to stay away from the area.
They're used to European tussles at Ibrox, but not with the authorities. 2 days before their UEFA Cup first-round match, Rangers are refusing to travel to Dagestan, refusing to put their players at risk. This is why. The Russian Republic lies just 100 miles from Chechnya. It's a region ravaged by war, with continual attacks on Russians and foreigners alike. And where Rangers have to go, Mahashkala, there was violence even last weekend.
My job is to ensure the safety of the travelling party, and we've received confirmation from UEFA that they believe they can guarantee safety. But if that means putting 2,500 security people, there must be an obvious concern.
Not enough concern, though, to persuade UEFA this match should be played elsewhere. When the Foreign Office advises strongly against flying to Dagestan, it's very difficult for Rangers to ignore that warning. And the fact is, there have been bombings and kidnappings there in the recent past. It's certainly not a clever place to be taking a football squad valued at around £70 million. The club has the backing of the fans as well. They'd prefer a fine and disqualification rather than take the risk.
I really feel that if it had been one of the so-called G12 clubs, the big clubs in Europe, this would not have happened. This game, I'm convinced, would have been moved 10 days, 2 weeks ago.
Any distant European tie can pose problems these days, but for the match with Anji Mahashkala, the dangers have little to do with football. David Eads, BBC News, Glasgow.
Well, let's return now to the United States and today's unprecedented terrorist onslaught, where thousands are now feared dead after a series of attacks in New York, Washington and beyond. President Bush, a few moments ago, apparently spoke for the second time about today's attack. He said that the principles of democracy would not be defeated and that the American nation would, he said, survive any attack.
I ask the American people to join me in saying a thanks for all the folks who have been fighting hard to rescue our fellow citizens, and to join me in saying a prayer for the victims and their families. The resolve of our great nation is being tested, but make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test. God bless.
Well, let's get the latest now from the States and our correspondent Jane Stanley. Jane, what is the latest information that you have for us?
Well, the information is not coming through very quickly, Hugh. As you can imagine, it's utter chaos here. People have really no idea what's going on. For example, behind me, where we can see the clouds of smoke coming from where the World Trade Center stood until this morning, people don't really know what's going on down there. All they know is that there are a lot of people, as we can see in the pictures you're seeing, a lot of people must have been working in that building already, and nobody knows where they are. We know that the hospitals here are treating people with very severe burns, as you'll be able to see ambulances rushing through the streets of New York, people unable to communicate with each other and check on their families, which is horrific, extremely sad and very upsetting for everyone here, and a feeling of what has happened? This cannot have happened. Did we collectively watch a film or a movie or something? This cannot have happened to us.
Jane, we heard the mayor of New York saying a short while ago that he thought countless numbers of people had lost their lives. Are they talking in any terms of numbers so that we can have an idea of the extent of this tragedy at all?
Only quite ridiculous numbers, really, that we had earlier on at 6 people confirmed dead and more than 1,000 injured. It's clearly going to be more what Mayor Rudy Giuliani says. It is very likely going to be thousands. There were 2 planes, for example, that collided with the World Trade Center. And, of course, that building, 50,000 people working there every day. And we know, of course, the people in the top floors had very, very little chance of survival. And what about the people who were underneath when huge amounts of rubble started falling? Every vehicle that comes down here, the ambulances behind me, they're covered with a thick coating, like a coating of snow, 4 or 5 inches thick from when the rubble and the dust is falling on people. So still no idea of really how many people have died, but it's not going to make happy viewing for anyone.
Obviously, Jane, and of particular concern the fact that several passenger planes are apparently still reported unaccounted for.
Exactly. There is a great fear that these 2 planes that crashed here, the one into the Pentagon in Washington, that was not the extent of what happened here, that there are reports that F-16 fighter bombers are out looking for another plane that was believed to be en route to Washington. There's also the plane that crashed outside Pittsburgh in Philadelphia. It's unbelievable, the scale of this. People are asking questions about the security agencies. And myself, for example, I'm thinking, well, why was baggage sent on a plane that I was on a few weeks ago without the passenger accompanying it? There's all those kind of loopholes in American security that's going to warrant a huge investigation and a lot of recrimination after what we've seen today.
Jane, in New York, thank you very much for the time being.